Welcome to the Capital News. I am your host, Alex Kreitis. Today is Friday, May 22nd, 2020. Thank you so much for joining me. Title of today's podcast is From Millions to Trillions. This is pretty much going to be a continuation of yesterday's podcast titled A Tale of Two Depressions, where we took the time to read a couple pages of Austrian economist Murray Rothbard's book, A History of Money and Banking in the United States, the Colonial Era to World War II. And of course, since we were focusing on the Depression, that is the era of time that we were most focused on, because we have been stating here for weeks. I mean, it's already the end of May. It might be a couple months already since this lockdown truly began, and the economic fallout that was likely to ensue and is going to transpire. And again, there were a whole host of issues and data points that we have been talking about here since this podcast has been online since last February, that this economy, in addition to the global economy, was slowing down well before the onset of COVID-19 and all of these lockdowns and other draconian measures. So we said we were headed for a recession, quite possibly a depression. Now with this lockdown, it is going to be a depression, pretty much guaranteed. All but guaranteed. And so I thought it prudent to do a little bit of studying on this. I have pretty much every book from Murray Rothbard. Again, like I said yesterday, I highly recommend you doing the same, getting all his books. I'm making my way about halfway through this book. Came across the Great Depression, 1930s. Read these pages. It's like, my goodness, they just jumped off the page. The words just jumped off the page. This is like reading a newspaper today, paying attention to what is going on today. This is the Great Depression, folks, of the 1930s. 90 years ago. Reads like it took place today, because it is. And that's what I've been saying. These jokers in Washington, D.C., are doing the same thing now that they did 90 years ago. And we're somehow supposed to think that this time's different, or it's going to be different because now they're smarter. We have the internet, we have the computers, and everything's just going to be A-OK. I beg to differ. So that was the point. Some of the names, not so relevant. Some of them are, faces change, names change. Sometimes the names don't change, right? We talked about Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs being involved, or people from Goldman Sachs being intimately involved with a lot of the policies that were implemented during the Great Depression. I mean, this is exactly who was running around in the White House, who still is, or in the Treasury Department. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin used to work at Goldman Sachs. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, under the George W. Bush administration during the Great Financial Crisis, worked for Goldman Sachs, and I think he was the CEO at one point. Hank Paulson was. Then you had Obama come in, and you had Timothy Geithner at the Treasury Secretary post. Well, he was the president of the New York Federal Reserve, who was there. His tenure was there during the Great Financial Crisis, the lead up to the Great Financial Crisis, and then all of the shenanigans of doling out all of that cheap money to bail out Wall Street. Well, why not make him the Treasury Secretary? Seems like the perfect candidate. Well, they did. And then he was replaced by Jack Lew, who at the time, right now I can't remember who he worked for, but I'm sure he was with a bank as well. So nothing changes, folks. It's one big club. You ain't in it. So sometimes the names don't even change. I do want to get to some market performance, and then we'll get back to Rothbard's book for a couple more pages, just to drill home the point we've been making. Mixed day on Wall Street. Dow Jones down 9 points, flat. The S&P gaining 7 points, up about 0.25%. NASDAQ 100 up about 0.4%. Across the pond in Europe, well, let's look at this. Here's a couple headlines, and again, I get most of this off of Trading Economics. It's a good snapshot of what took place. Here's a couple headlines. ECB sees the euro area ECB sees the euro area economy shrinking by as much as 12%. The very next headline, European shares mostly higher on stimulus hopes. So the euro area is going to collapse by 12% because that's a collapse. But stocks were mostly higher, at least according to this headline. Of course, they were more mixed, on stimulus hopes. This is like driving the car off the cliff, but thinking a parachute is going to deploy, so everything's going to be okay. That just doesn't make sense, but this is the financial road of Oz in which we have been in for quite a while. Nothing's going to change. You can't make heads or tails of it, so I guess you just got to go with the flow. But across the pond, UK markets were down 0.4%. Germany was flat. French markets were flat. Italy was up 1.3%. And the Spanish markets were relatively flat, up about 0.15%. So that's not mostly higher off of the back of stimulus hopes. I mean, we'll see what takes place next week, but don't tell me that they're mostly higher, because they're just not. They're not. They're flat. But nonetheless, everybody's hoping for stimulus. And if you need the stimulus, it's because things aren't looking good. But somehow all of that has been priced in, or all of that's been discounted. I don't think so. WTI, crude oil, $33.45 a barrel. Brent, $35.22 a barrel, both down for the day. Natural gas up a little bit, $1.74 per million British thermal units. Gold and silver gained a little bit. Gold, $1,732 an ounce. Silver, $17.18 an ounce. Uncle Sam's 10-year Treasury note down, yielding spot 0.66%. And I do believe the Hong Kong market was down significantly. Let me just confirm that for you 1 second, because obviously that news out of China with the proposed legislation coming forward, that Hong Kong market, the Hang Seng, was down over 1,300 points, representing a decline of 5.5 percentage points. So a huge drop in the Hong Kong markets. And again, this was on the back of that proposed legislation out of Beijing that is supposed to rein in some of the sovereignty and some of the rights of Hong Kong and the people therein. So that is not going to bode well for the protests. They will pick up, as we have been saying here, mark my words, and they will be coming to a theater near you as well in due time. So back to the book. Again, a history of money and banking in the United States. A couple more pages, and then we'll let you enjoy the long weekend. So we left off with a quote from the New York Federal Reserve President, George Harrison, where he exclaimed, "Gentlemen, I am ready to provide all the reserve funds that may be needed," highly reminiscent of Chairman of the Federal Reserve today, Jerome Powell, standing at the ready to print, do whatever he's got to do. Okay? So continuing, by mid-November, the great stock break was over, and the market, artificially buoyed and stimulated by expanding credit, began to move upward again. With the stock market emergency seemingly over, bank reserves were allowed to decline by the end of November by about $275 million to just about the level before the crash. By the end of the year, total bank reserves at $2.35 billion were almost exactly the same as they had been the day before the crash, or at the end of November, with total bank deposits increasing slightly during this period. But, and this is an important point, but while the aggregates of factors determining reserves were the same, their distribution was very different. Fed ownership of government securities had increased by $375 million during these 2 months, from the level of $136 million before the crash. But the expansion had been offset by lower bank loans from the Fed, by greater money in circulation, and by people drawing $100 million of gold out of the banking system. In short, the Federal Reserve tried its best to inflate a great deal more, but its expansionary policy was partially thwarted by increasing caution and by withdrawal of money from the banking system by the general public. Now, I know a lot of this sounds boring and bland and this, that, or the other, but it highlights the point that I am making. What we are doing today is what they did 90 years ago. Again, the title of today's podcast is From Millions to Trillions. From millions to billions, from billions to trillions, right? So anytime you hear the word million, think today it's billion. If anytime you hear the word billion, think trillion today. We talk about the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. We talked about it yesterday. It is now exceeding $7 trillion, slightly above $7 trillion. A couple of months ago, it was at what, 3.8 trillion? Okay? So we've in effect doubled it. It will be doubled in short order. Make no mistake about it. It might even triple in short order. Don't be surprised if that happens. Well, that's exactly what happened in the 1930s. Again, Fed ownership of government securities, treasury bonds and bills and notes, had increased by 375 million during these 2 months. This time, not 375 million over 2 months. This time it was 2.5 trillion, almost 3 trillion over 2 months. In an over week basis, again, today, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet being at $7 trillion, week over week increase of $103 billion. And again, just for a little perspective, I believe it was quantitative easing number 3, where it was $85 billion per month. Per month, just for a little perspective. So now you understand what these guys are doing and how they're getting away with it. So just understand these points. They're doing the same thing. Now, it's refreshing to see here how the American people weren't falling for this BS back then. And they say, oh, no, something's wrong here. And of course, back then, we still had a gold standard. So all of that paper currency that you had, that was really just a receipt. It was easier, I guess, to fold up the bills, put them in your pocket, carry those around than it was to carry around some gold. But people knew what money was back then. It was gold. The paper currency was just a receipt. Take the receipt to the bank, get your gold, that's your real money, go home, do what you want with it. The American people were smart then. They understood what was going on. Now everybody's doped up on Prozac and crack cocaine. Nobody could give a damn. Continuing. Here we see at the very beginning of the Hoover era the spuriousness of the monetarist legend that the Federal Reserve was responsible for the great contraction of money from 1929 to 1933. On the contrary, the Fed and the administration tried their best to inflate, efforts foiled by the good sense and by the increasing distrust of the banking system of the American people. Because those of you who pay attention a little bit more to economic history, or at least some of the rhetoric that is floated out there, when you listen to some of the financial mainstream media, when you have people on there talking about the Great Depression and this, that, or the other, they say, oh, well, it was a mistake because the Federal Reserve did not expand their balance sheet enough. They didn't expand the money supply by a large enough amount to thwart the Great Depression. And as Rothbard rightly points out, on the contrary, they tried their damnedest, and they got away with it for a little while. And the American people called BS. They said, we don't trust you guys. We want our real money. Pulled the rug out from underneath them. But a lot of the damage had already been done. Okay? So it's a very important point to note, because you're not going to hear this most anywhere else, because it doesn't fit the narrative. Former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, was supposedly this genius financial economist and a master student of the Great Depression. And lo and behold, just coincidentally, he happens to be there during the Great Financial Crisis, an episode that we have not seen since the Great Depression. And this guy happens to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Oh boy, how lucky we were, huh? And what did he do? Well, he bought into the nonsense that the Federal Reserve didn't do enough, that they didn't try to inflate. So he put the pedal to the metal. And we've been living with that fraudulent and flawed economic experiment that we continue to live through with quantitative easing, zero interest rate policy, and mark my words, we will have negative interest rates here in this country on a nominal basis. They're already here on a real basis. They will be here nominally. They will be, unless the market has a field day. And if that happens, that's a completely different picture, and things are really going to get ugly. At any rate, even though the Fed had not managed to inflate the money supply further, President Hoover was proud of his experiment in cheap money and of the Fed's massive open market purchases. In a speech to a conference of industrial leaders he had called together in Washington on December 5th, the president hailed the nation's good fortune in possessing the splendid Federal Reserve System, which had succeeded in saving shaky banks, restoring confidence, and making capital more abundant by lowering interest rates. Could we swap out President Hoover's name with President Trump? Praising the Federal Reserve, because he did praise Jerome Powell recently. I don't know if you caught that or not. He called him MIP, not MVP, most valuable player. He called him MIP, again referring to Jay Powell, the most improved player. And of course, the president has been calling a whole bunch of industrialists to the White House and business leaders to talk about a whole host of issues, which he should be doing. So that's not surprising. But isn't it highly coincidental and interesting how not much really changes? Hoover had personally done his part by urging banks to discount more at the Fed, while Secretary Mellon reverted to his old Pollyanna mode in assuring one and all that there was, quote, plenty of credit available. Now that sounds more like Mnuchin. Plenty of credit available, and we will do whatever it takes. Hoover admirer William Green, head of the American Federation of Labor, proclaimed that, quote, the Federal Reserve System is serving as a barrier against financial demoralization. Within a few months, industrial conditions will become normal. Confidence and stabilization in industry and finance will be restored, end quote. Can we say famous last words? Because that didn't happen. Could we swap his name out with Larry Kudlow, economic advisor to the president? By the end of 1929, Roy Young and other Federal Reserve officials favored pursuing a laissez-faire policy, quote, to let the money market sweat it out and reach monetary ease by the wholesome process of liquidation, end quote. See, people still understood, even some members within the Federal Reserve understood then, that markets have to function. Markets caused a problem, markets will fix it. Now, of course, the problem was caused more by government intervention in the Federal Reserve, but at least they understood that the market was going to be the best doctor to solve this problem. Allow the bankruptcies, allow the liquidations, allow the malinvestments to sort themselves through. Once again, Harrison and the New York Federal Reserve overruled Washington and instituted a massive easy money program. Discount rates of the New York Fed fell from 4.5% in February to 2% at the end of 1930. I told you yesterday, only a couple pages ahead, they were going to cut interest rates down to 2%. Because yesterday we talked about them being at 6%. They dropped them to 4.5%. I said, whoa, Nelly, how could they tolerate that then? The United States in 2018 couldn't tolerate 2.25%, 2.5%. So they're going to have to cut them deeper. Well, they did. 4.5 to 2. 4.5 to 2. But that's where they stopped. They didn't take them to zero. They didn't take them to negative. Other short-term interest rates fell similarly. Once again, the New York Fed led the inflationist parade by purchasing $218 million of government securities during the year. The resulting increase of $116 million in bank reserves, however, was offset by bank failures in the latter part of the year and by enforced contraction on the part of the shaky banks remaining in business. As a result, total money supply remained constant throughout 1930. Expansion was also cut short by the fact that the stock market boomlet early in the year had collapsed by the spring. Now this is also interesting here. This gets more to a little bit more of the internationalist aspect of central banking. During the year, however, Montague Norman, again, this was the governor of the Bank of England at the time, was able to achieve part of his long-standing wish for formal collaboration between the world's major central banks. Norman pushed through a new central bank, Bankers' Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS or BIS, to meet regularly at Basel, that being in Switzerland, and to provide regular facilities for cooperation. While the suspicious Congress forbade the Federal Reserve from joining the BIS formally, the New York Federal Reserve and its allied Morgan interests, again, the House of Morgan, J.P. Morgan, were able to work closely with the new bank. The BIS indeed treated the New York Fed as if it were the central bank of the United States. Gates W. McGarrah, resigned as chairman of the board of the New York Fed in February to assume the position of president of the biz, while Jackson E. Reynolds, a director of the New York Fed, particularly close to the Morgan interests, became chairman of the biz's organizing committee. Unsurprisingly, J.P. Morgan and Company supplied much of the capital for the new bank for international settlements. And even though there was no legislative sanction for U.S. participation in the bank, New York Fed Governor George Harrison made a regular business trip abroad in the fall to confer with the other central bankers. And the New York Fed extended loans to the biz during 1931. You can't make this stuff up. They are above the law. Congress knew, like we said yesterday, Congress and the American people still knew what it meant to be an American. They understood the ideals and the laws of this country, and they respected them. Laissez-faire economics, the 1920-1921 recession. Herbert Hoover at the time, Commerce Secretary, do something. No, we're not going to do anything. We're going to let the market solve the problem. And it did, and it was a recession, not a depression. Herbert Hoover vowed, if anything, if I become president, if this should happen again, I'm going to stand at the ready, and we are going to do something, for God's sake. And he did. They did, in conjunction with the Federal Reserve, and it turned what would have been a severe recession into the Great Depression. And here we are doing the same things once again. Congress didn't want to be a part. The American people didn't want to be a part of this international system. But that's what they've adopted. That's what's here, all of this massive coordination. They're all supposed to be independent. No, they're all doing the same thing. It's a race to the bottom. It's a currency war. How many podcasts have we had with those types of titles, or at least had those types of discussions within several of our podcasts over the past year? And it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse. Because they just keep trying to debase, inflate. Because that's what they know how to do. Those are the tools in their toolkit. Get ready, folks. So, the names, the people, the Federal Reserve at that time they completely acted with impunity. They didn't care. They gave the middle finger to Congress. We don't care. What are you going to do about it? Some of our people are going to resign, and we're going to go be the chairman of the board of the Bank for International Settlements. And nothing was done about it, just like today. And like the podcast title the other day, nobody cares. Nobody cares. Late 1930 was perhaps the last stand of the laissez-faire sound money liquidationists. Professor H. Parker Willis, a tireless critic of the Fed's inflationism and credit expansion, attacked the current easy money policy of the Fed in an editorial in the New York Journal of Commerce. Willis pointed out that the Fed's easy money policy was actually bringing about the rash of bank failures because of the bank's inability to liquidate their unsound loans and assets. Willis noted that the country was suffering from frozen, wasteful malinvestments in plants, buildings, and other capital, and maintained that the depression could only be cured when these unsound credit positions were allowed to liquidate. Amen, brother, because that is what is supposed to happen. Continuing, quote, our depression has been prolonged and not alleviated by delay in making necessary readjustments. Let the markets solve themselves, ladies and gentlemen. That is the moral of the story. It's American. It's in agreement with free market capitalism. And by definition, it is free market capitalism. It doesn't mean that these businesses go away forever. Some of them might, but that's okay because there's some entrepreneur waiting in the wings who knows how to do a better job. And that's what we want. We want the best running our companies, small, mid, large cap, mega cap. We want the best. And if you continue to prop up poor management and poor businesses, well, then you're going to get these zombie companies, and they're going to suck the life out of those strong entrepreneurs trying to make it. And who would be 10 times better, which would make it 10 times better for the rest of us. Have better jobs, better pay, better products, better services, lower costs. That's how it works. But central bankers don't want to take responsibility. Politicians don't want to take responsibility. So they're going to continue trying to keep it all propped up. They're trying to keep this Ponzi scheme going. That's how fragile the system is. That's how apparent it will be to everybody if this thing collapses. And it's going to. And everybody is going to understand the man behind the curtain, pulling on the strings. And of course, as I like to say now, especially this audience, we know the curtain's been removed. They're in your face every day. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, the President of the United States, Larry Kudlow, Peter Navarro, Stephen Mnuchin. They're all in your face. They can play politics all they want, but guess what? At the end of the day, they pass those bills, don't they? They sign those bills into legislation, into law, don't they? And who's got to pay for it? You do. And who gets the bulk of the loot? Not you. Follow the money. Ask who benefits. And now we're seeing across the news wires that Mitch McConnell is now getting ready, in conjunction with the White House, to pass yet another spending bill. Surprise, surprise, we told you it was just theater a couple of weeks ago. Sticking their feet in the sand, saying, oh, no, we're not going to bail out the states. They squandered their resources prior to COVID-19. Shame on them. I told you they'd come back for more. It's not done. This is 2020. It's a presidential election. They don't want to be pitted into the corner, this being the Republicans, by the Democrats to say, look, they don't care about you. They bailed out the big Wall Street banks. They bailed out the big corporations. They bailed out the airlines, the energy sector, and they gave you $1,200. No, we want to give you even more. That's politically persuasive to people. It's a bunch of nonsense. We don't have the money to do it, but nobody cares. Everybody's going to care on the other side of this. Believe me when I tell you, because there is no free lunch. Free was never so expensive. Believe me when I tell you, your options are you're going to default outright, meaning we're not going to pay anybody who owns our debt. We're going to inflate it away, maybe some minor inflation. There will be a period of stagflation in this country, meaning inflation is going to exist with a stagnant economy. And then you have the option of hyperinflating away these debts. And I think that's likely the outcome. It's a process. It'll take time to get there, but that's likely what's going to happen because we have a U.S. national debt at $25,472 billion as I speak, as I'm looking at usdebtclock.org right now. $25,472 billion. You know, we were kind of joking, but not really. For the past couple of weeks, just the increase in the national debt over the past week and a half, in saying just, over a weekend, a few days, we added more to the U.S. national debt than what Bill Gates, his net worth is, what took him his entire life to accumulate, was spent by this government over a weekend. Give a couple days. I mean, that would have been one hell of a weekend, spending that kind of money. You would have had a blast. But Bill Gates would be broke. So again, it goes to the Looney Tune ideology of Democrats to think that they can pay for everything just by taxing Bill Gates a little bit more. We could have taken everything the man is worth, and it only would have financed us for a weekend. That was when we just crossed over $25 trillion. We've added almost $500 billion since then. So now you got to take away Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Larry Ellison of Oracle. You can probably even throw in Mike Bloomberg into the mix, and you're probably still not there as to what we just done over the past couple of weeks. So it's ludicrous. It's basic arithmetic. $4 trillion deficit that we're supposed to hit. I bet it'll be more, but of course, fiscal year ends at the end of September, so we'll see what happens. But if Congress does get together, and they most likely will, pass another spending bill. I don't like using the word stimulus, or I'll say quote unquote, because it's just spending, because there's nothing stimulative about it. It's just an attempt to fill an ever bigger hole. And if everything's supposed to be great, and if there is really supposed to be a V-shaped recovery across the board, then why do we need more spending? Isn't everything going to come roaring back? Isn't that what we've been told here now for a couple months? Ever since we really locked this thing down, there's going to be this massive amount of pent-up demand. Everything's going to be greater than before. All of the boastfulness, all of the bragging, everything. Just like President Hoover, President Trump's doing the same thing. The years change, the names change, that's about it. $25.5 trillion. By the end of this year, not the fiscal year, but by the end of the calendar year, where are we going to be? 27, 28 trillion? Maybe 30. Maybe 30 trillion. And what happens if there isn't a V-shaped recovery? What happens if everything doesn't come roaring back? Where will we be next year? 32, 35 trillion? I mean, if reading Rothbard's book doesn't drive home the point to you guys, I don't know what will, unless it's actually seeing it unfold before us. And I hope it doesn't happen, but it's going to, because that's the math of it. It's just the way it works. They can attempt to kick this can as far down the road as they want to, but doing so, in my opinion, it's most definitely unethical, immoral, and un-American. And it's pretty damn right close to criminal, in my opinion, too. Because it's just ridiculous. No bailouts. But this is the road that they're going down. Expanding the money supply, expanding the balance sheet, exactly what the Federal Reserve did then, exactly what the president wanted in the 1930s. Congress went along with the ride, exactly what's taking place now. And now today we're supposed to think that it's going to be different. Well, you can put your money where your mouth is. Good luck to you. I do the same. Good luck to me. We'll see what happens. That's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. From millions to trillions. It's going to be a long weekend, so I will catch you here next week. Enjoy the Memorial Day holiday. Stay diversified, stay vigilant, and stay with the Capital News. I am Alex Kreitis. Godspeed.